Just really wanted to say thank you so much for coming, because I think that in this January freeze, no one wants to leave their house at all, so we really appreciate you coming. But I also have to say that I'm really excited about this talk because Rachel, there we go, Rachel Maclean, Andy Holden and Lydia Chan are brilliant, and we're really lucky to have them here this evening. So, yeah, just waiting for the last couple of people to come and sit down. I hope everybody's had a chance to wander around Lydia's exhibition as well. We have had such a good response to it. And again, I think it's that thing of getting out and seeing a space with colour. And I hope everybody's done the AR as well, which is kind of exceptional. So I suppose the idea behind this talk was the idea of different worlds. I really feel about these three artists that they look into creating different worlds, but they also create testing juxtapositions. And I suppose what I mean by that is they look at different things, so it may be horror movies, or it may be monsters, and they kind of mash them up. So there's this sort of idea of a cultural mashing up which goes on in their work. I thought I'd just sort of let you know what this evening is about, well, just how it's going to work. We've got Rachel talking, she's got some slides and some film, I'm hoping, because that's kind of important in your work. And then Andy is going to talk. And then Lydia, we're actually going to show a film that was made by our wonderful kind of in-house filmmaker, Carlos. And we're going to show that film because that shows how, well, the sort of ideas behind the exhibition, so we thought that would be useful. And then I'll ask everybody a couple of questions, and then we're really hoping that you also will ask some questions, because, you know, that's why you're here. Hopefully there's some questions you'd like to ask some of the artists, so that would be good. So I'm going to start with Rachel. And weirdly, I've got Andy as the start here, so that's really confused me. Did we said Andy originally? Okay, that's fine. So Rachel's just finished a really fantastic show, which I would recommend you go to, but actually, unfortunately, it's just finished, hasn't it? At Josh Lilly. India and I went, and we were really impressed by just how many different ideas were in the show, and also the different mediums. So you had sculpture and also sort of painting, digital work, and a really extraordinary animation. I think what interests me about your work is the relationship between kind of saccharine sweetness and a sort of grim despair, and I love that. And also, I think you look at the way life deals with women, and again, that I find fascinating. And again, you perform a lot in your work, and yet the animation no longer has you as a performer, so I'm hoping we're going to talk a little bit about that. And also I think one thing that you'll find is we've got serious characters going on in this talk. And they're often to do with kind of Disney or horror or fantasy, and there's also kind of political elements. So I'm hoping that you're going to talk a little bit about that in your sort of 10 minutes, and then we'll go on to Andy, and then we'll talk to Lydia. Thanks very much.
Hello, so lovely to be here. Thank you so much to our gallery. And to Lydia for the invitation. It's lovely to be here. So I thought I'd start by showing you a 2-minute film that's just a kind of cut together of loads of my work so you can get a sense of what it is initially. So here we go. So I thought I'd start talking about my film Feed Me as an example of a way that I work, or a way that I've worked quite often in the last kind of 10, 12 years. So in Feed Me, like a lot of my work, I'm the only character. And I dress up in elaborate costume and prosthetic makeup and kind of distort my face to become these different characters. So, for example, like kind of Disney children or aged into these kind of grotesque older characters, or a fairy tale witch, or kind of almost grotesque kind of living Care Bears. I work almost exclusively in these pieces with green screen. Do you think it's better without a mic? Is it? Yeah. I'll just speak loudly. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I work in these pieces almost exclusively with green screens, so I create kind of elaborate digital worlds to set them in. And I also don't use my own voice. I use the voices of actors or voices taken from kind of films and cut from audio and YouTube, which I mine to. So the works come together as these quite complex illusions that feel at once a little bit like cartoons, but they're not cartoons because you know that there's somebody beneath the surface. With Feed Me, and like a lot of my work, the aesthetic is very feminine and kind of saccharine and pink, and I'm interested in that in a political sense because I think that often people have a response to that kind of aesthetic which is a kind of reflex of thinking it's kind of silly or almost finding it at some level offensive, and I play on that, and I want there to be a certain kind of response in that way, or a response of offence. And I play on it also in terms of expectation, because the work isn't soft and it isn't necessarily saccharine. The themes in it are often kind of dark and take you a little bit by surprise and are intended to unsettle you. With Feed Me, and again, like a lot of my works, I play on this idea of also kind of pushing an aesthetic to a point where it almost tips into its opposite. So in Feed Me, I talk a lot about 110%, or the characters talk about being too happy. So there's the sense of like you reach 100% and then you push it and it's too far and it kind of like slips into something dark and unsettling. Another theme in my work, and this is a film I made in 2012 called The Lion and the Unicorn, is national identity. And this film was made in the run-up to the Scottish referendum on independence. And something I think kind of since then I've become quite obsessed with is this idea of binary. And I think maybe in the last 10 years, because I and maybe all of us have been presented with politics in this binary way, so yes, no, and then shortly afterwards Brexit, leave, remain, and you start to kind of see your world in terms of these binaries. So a lot of my work has that kind of sense of opposites, but then complicates them somehow. So The Lion and the Unicorn is this kind of take on Scottishness with a lion representing England, the unicorn representing Scotland, but in this very kind of camp and absurdist and playful way. So playing with these kind of ideas of binary and complicating it a bit. This is a film, Spite Your Face, I made in 2017, and something that I did with this film, and again, like with a lot of my works, is take something very obvious. So the film is about lying, and I made it in the run-up to Brexit and also kind of shortly after Trump got into power. And it was for Venice, so there was this kind of Italian aspect to it. So it's a kind of Pinocchio-style fairy tale, but with a modern context. And I'm quite interested artistically in things that are very obvious like that. So Pinocchio, lying, it's something that you kind of can immediately get. So maybe as opposed to finding something very obscure in an archive, I'm into the idea of taking that thing that's kind of in your face, and in Venice is kind of everywhere. It's like part of the sort of touristic culture of the city, and interrogating it and doing something weird with it. And a lot of my work in films kind of play with this idea of fairy tale or updating a fairy tale to a modern context. This is kind of like a quick run through all the work I've ever made, but this is a film I made, or actually a VR piece called I'm Terribly Sorry, which is also kind of along the lines of national identity with more of a sort of Brexit context. And with this I was interested in the technology of VR and this experience which is very different to film, where you're this kind of first person experience. So the characters in the film approach you and talk to you, and you have some kind of degree of control, and it slightly interrogates the amount of control you have over that experience. And the world is this almost Brexit dystopia with these oversized
bits of tourist hat that kind of loom over you. And I quite like it as a medium because the sense of kind of scale and the almost vertigo of that is very experiential in the way that I don't think you quite get that to the same extent with film. Still on my kind of Brexit obsession, I made this work in 2019, Native Animals, which is a kind of Beatrix Potter style Peter Rabbit satire that I guess I wanted to look, and similar to what I've done quite often, look at a kind of childish fantasy. So the kind of fantasies of children's television or the fantasies of children's literature, and take that almost as a adult utopia or an imagined kind of utopian space and interrogate that. And I think in particular the kind of Beatrix Potter Peter Rabbit world is this kind of England's green and pleasant land version of a sort of class system with very little social mobility. So I was interested in taking that and kind of playing with it and satirising it. I'll skip on to my most recent work, which was Mimi, which is the first time I've worked entirely in animation. And I made this during lockdown, kind of at a time where it was very hard to film anything, which is partly why I made animation. But partly I was also interested in creating a character that almost started with merchandise, but in a slightly satirical way. So I started off with this doll, so a kind of topsy-turvy doll, and then from there developed it into this film narrative that plays with the sense of a character being turned upside down, or a world being turned upside down. I've expanded this piece, so originally I made it for Jupiter Artland, which is a sculpture park outside Edinburgh, and you experience it by walking through a forest and you come upon this kind of shop almost that feels a bit Hansel and Gretel, and it's got that kind of candy coloured aesthetic that draws you in and is quite jarring with the natural environment. So you go inside and it's stocked with these dolls, and then the animation is on the back wall. Sorry, I think this is my fault. I might have put all these images on top of a video. Let's ignore that. And I wanted with this work, I always think about with sculpture parks this sense of like, what's it going to look like in 20 years' time if nobody looks after this? So I almost wanted from a base level for it to look like it was decayed, or something that had kind of been set into the landscape and then being graffitied. So it's got this odd sense of having been decayed before it was even open. And I've got quite into this sort of upside down idea and been playing a bit more with it. So I've been making digital paintings, which are kind of part digital, part real paintings, that play with this idea of an upside down world and can literally be turned on their head and read differently. So it's this sense of images kind of containing their opposite or containing a kind of different reading depending what way you look at them. I've probably gone way over 10 minutes.
No, that's fantastic. I just wanted to go, there's one thing I noticed about, I think it's the one just before this one. So as far as I can see a skull in there. So
yes.
It's like you've got so many layers to your work. You have the kind of this sort of surface, which is then interesting because it's like in all your work, it's like you have kind of surface beauty. I was reading about it. It's like the idea of beauty enhanced, digested, and regurgitated, and that that there is always something underneath the kind of outside vision.
Yeah, I think I like that idea that you're kind of sucked in by the work, and there's a surface level at which you're sucked in that maybe is quite familiar, and it's quite soft and welcoming, and then there's something beneath the surface that's kind of rotting or decaying, or that it reveals itself, but only after you look close.
It's terrifying because you have the kind of very slightly plastic-looking Cinderella sort of type creature, and then she pulls up her skirt and reveals, an old lady, which again I think is an interesting. You were talking about, the idea of breaking out of a feminist mould, and I'm interested in the idea that the way you look at women, and that you have this kind of old creature rears its ugly head. And I think you're interested in kind of influences maybe as well. And so you're making quite a judgment on beauty and the way we judge beauty. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I think so. I wanted, at least in the work that I made for Jupiter Artland, to kind of interrogate the sense of maybe newness. I think so much of our culture is obsessed with newness and not just youth, like literal youth and beauty, but also newness in the sense of like the presentation of things constantly being renewed, and it's almost this fear of decline that's kind of built into capitalism, that I wanted to play on those two things. So there's both the sense of the fear of aging, and particularly female aging, but this fear of this decline of this world that we know and what comes in its wake. And so I wanted to play on that as a kind of relationship.
And I think that's what is in all your work, is this sort of dichotomy of two things going on, and the balance between them in some way. I was just interested in, before we go on to Andy, which we will very shortly, was the, actually filmmaking, and as a filmmaker as well, the whole idea of having to collaborate with other people, and yet you have such a clear vision. How easy is it to go on a set, get someone else to put your makeup on? Is it quite like you imagined it was going to be? Deal with, sometimes you have somebody else directing you. Actually, fuck off! I want to do it like. So how do you work in the kind of in that way?
I think it's really hard. I think that, well, I came from painting, and I guess that's like this idea of you alone as an artist, and you're just expressing yourself, and you don't need to communicate. Notionally, it's not necessarily the reality, but I came from that rather than like a filmmaking background, so I've had to learn this whole aspect of my practice, which is communicating the thing in your head to other people. And sometimes it's really hard, like with the animation it was hard because you're communicating something that I think I would, if I was acting it, I'd do naturally. So you just like make a micro expression that communicates something, and you never need to think about why that works or what it means. But the minute you animate it, you have to deconstruct everything, work out why it is that works and why that timing works. And so it becomes like, yeah, it was difficult, but I think I got there with it. And yeah, but sometimes it can be like, yeah, a struggle to get the thing out of your mind and perceived by somebody before it's really kind of been fully realised.
And we were talking about this because obviously Lydia worked with two people to create the AR that I hope you've all seen, and just we'll come on to Lydia, but that idea of, I feel with all of you three, that you have amazing visions in your head, and then actually to realise them is maybe the most difficult bit. Andy, do you want to come and take a view? And the first thing of Andy's that I saw was Art Angel. I don't know if anybody saw it, but it was amazing. It was nests and eggs, and it was truly fascinating collection of extraordinary nests. And I like that you had a sort of different opinion about. So you were working with your dad, and the idea that he thought that nests were evolutionary imperatives, whereas you were talking about chance and sort of free will. So maybe you'll talk about that, maybe not. I love that you're interested in, or maybe even obsessed with nostalgia, and you say, why does a nostalgic object cast such an inescapable spell, which I think is true. And then also, which I think there is a sense of kind of the cartoon universe that all three of you use, and actually that cartoon universe is a metaphor for a precarious world, that we're actually, maybe it's easier to show this world as you do in a kind of completely extreme way than sort of doing it in a real way. I don't know. Beano, if you haven't been to Beano at Sunset House, go. It's the most brilliant exhibition which Andy has curated. And the thing that I particularly love about it is not only seeing all the Beano, but the artists that Andy has brought in that have a kind of relationship and connection with Beano.
I could actually talk about you further, so I'm going to shut up. Go for it.
Is everyone okay? Can you hear us? Do you want me to try the mic? Like right back. Can you hear this? Yeah, right there. Okay. So if I talk at this level, all right. Okay. I'm just going to show you a few slides, just so because if you don't know my work, I'll give you like a little intro to what I do, and then I just scribbled some notes, and I'm just going to read them actually because I'm sure I could hold them in my head. So I'm just going to introduce a few pieces. This is a work from about 12 years ago called Pyramid Piece and Return of the Pyramid Piece. And it's all knitted. It's like enormous textile work, and it's based on a tiny fragment of rock that I stole from the Great Pyramids of Giza when I was a kid. I was on a trip with my dad, who is a bird watcher, and he would travel to do talks on birds and go bird watching. And I went with him when I was quite young on this amazing trip around the Middle East. And yeah, I saw this saw the pyramids for the first time, and it kind of blew my mind. And I guess I wanted something authentic. You know, I don't know what this impulse was, but the impulse was to take something, to take a piece of rock off the pyramid and take it home with me. But when I got home, I felt pretty bad about it. I felt guilty, and it became this weird guilt object in my life. Like I kind of wished I hadn't taken it, because my dad said to me, you know, if everyone had done that, there'd be no pyramid left. I was like, this is the categorical imperative, and this was kind of terrifying to me. So I travelled to Cairo. 15 years later, I went to Cairo, and I put the piece of rock back into the pyramid from where I'd stolen it. And then I made this knitted replica of it, which I showed at Tate Britain, alongside a video of me putting the piece of rock back in. So that maybe introduces some of the themes of the work. This is a piece from this year. It's 480 works that no one's really ever seen before from my storage in a house, a 3-story house, like installed floor to ceiling with all these pieces. It came from getting evicted during lockdown from my storage barn because it got turned into a huge drugs operation, and I had to get out of the way. And then my studio was on the news with this drugs bust. Anyway, so I had to get out, and then I realised that no one had ever seen all these things I made. And so I rented this house and filled it with all the works, and then I had an estate agent 3D scan it. So not many people have seen this, so if you want to go on my website, you can still see this show. If you go on there and click on Collected Domestic Conceptualism, you can go around around that house and see all these small fragments from works that I've made over the last decade. This was what was just mentioned, little details from Natural Selection, which is a collaboration with my dad. So my dad's an ornithologist, and it was kind of exploring, tentatively, the whole thing was framed like a natural history show, like we were talking about birds and birds' eggs, but really I guess it was also me and my dad's relationship was kind of on show. It was a sort of 2-man play. He was on one screen, I was on the other, and we were arguing about what birds know in the act of making a nest. I was arguing it was kind of sculpture, he was arguing it was a kind of Darwinian evolution. So that was a big willow in the bower, which is like the only sculpture made by an animal. Well, I mean, it's like a kind of extension of nest building, and it's a display mechanism, it's not a nest. So it's the point that me and my dad's kind of interests maybe collide. And then I made 4,000 replica porcelain eggs, which you showed, which are downstairs, which is with a film about the social history of egg collecting and man's desire to steal birds' eggs and hoard them. Laws of Motion in a Cartoon Landscape is an hour-long animation about how the world is best understood as a cartoon, which I'll talk about in my which was shown in Glasgow and a number of other places. I'll talk about that at the end. And then I made a sequel to it, which called Structure of Feeling, which was a ghost train ride, where you had to take a mobility scooter, which was decked out like a theme park car, and drive. You could only drive around the exhibition, and you had to stop and park up, and then you could watch the films when you were parked up, like a kind of drive, somewhere between a drive-in cinema and a sort of Disneyland theme park, but quite bleakly. All the videos are made out of little bits of reused cartoon imagery, and then I put myself in the cartoons as a cartoon character to recite kind of monologues. There's a big 3D printed kind of version of me as a cartoon character in the middle.
Sorry, where was that one shown?
Actually, there's a warehouse in Brixton that's called Block 336. It's a really cool project space. I work a lot. I do a lot of project space shows still. I mean, this is obviously a big institution, but because you get a lot of freedom. I don't think you'd got away with doing that show anywhere else if you're going to sort of have everyone drive around in circles in very breakable cars. This is like a plug really. This is on at Somerset House, and it's me wearing a red and black striped curator's hat, and it's a history of the Beano comic, which I loved the Beano when I was a kid. You know, it's just like my intro, and as I was thinking about it, it was kind of my intro into art in some ways. Is I used to copy it out, and it's how I learned to draw. I think was copying out these cartoon characters, and so when the Beano asked me if I wanted to do this, I was ambivalent about taking the role of the curator, but I was kind of thrilled to like immerse myself back in the starting point. You know, a lot of my work is about dropping yourself back in somewhere in time where you've been before. That's I think true. Like it's like sometimes it's like a time traveling experiment. Like with the pyramid pieces, these like loops in time. So I go back to somewhere and kind of try and re-understand it. So with the pyramid piece, it was trying to understand what this desire to take this thing was. And then this kind of emotional experiment of whether it could be undone. And so the Beano, in a way, is not so dissimilar. You go back to the starting point and you kind of mine it. You get back inside it and you inhabit it and you try and work it out from the inside. But it is a history of the Beano. It's got 100 original Beano drawings from the archive, and then peppered through it in this kind of elaborate mise-en-scène. The whole thing is a scaled-up Beano. Artist works who I feel either like are indebted some way to the sensibility of the Beano or help us pull out themes of the Beano, and Rachel has some work in the show. It's a kind of cultural history, the cultural history of this comic that's been running for 80 years, the longest running comic in Britain, and the way it permeates culture at an unconscious level, which I think is a lot of the things my work unpicks. It's the sort of the level of these kind of quiet influences. And then within it there's a fictional gallery within the Beano, so the whole thing is a fictional show set within the Beano, within the fictional Beano Museum inside it, which I built. All right. Yeah. Give me a sec. But yeah, so as not to make it just sort of a slideshow, I just wrote this thing in a Cafe Nero 15 minutes ago. So I was reading what I was sent through, and it said something about beyond the normal, and I thought, no, my work is kind of obsessed with the normal, like and trying to actually understand what the normal is. Like when I was a teenager, I wrote a manifesto, which was maximum irony, maximum sincerity, or MIMS, and this to me feels like a good way to be in the world, to approach it with both irony and sincerity at the same time. It's a good way to try and understand the normal. Laws of Motion was an update of this in many ways. The premise is that the world is now, in fact, a cartoon, and therefore the only way to exist in the world is to become a cartoon character. The world, in fact, has come to resemble a cartoon so closely that you must sort of over-identify with that mechanism. So you take a look outside at the Greenwich. You know, I've not been here since I was a student in New Cross, which was like 20 years ago, and we used to take drugs in New Cross and just get the DLR through all the way down to the end and back and just look out the window. And I mean, it is kind of a cartoon of capitalism. So my advice would be to be like Bugs Bunny. You've got to both know and not know. Be aware of the laws, but also you've got to ignore them. But pure ignorance won't work, because it can be used against you. You have to both know and not know. So law one is anybody in space will remain in space until made aware of its situation. So if you look down, then you fall down. So you walk out over the cliff, you've got to be both aware of the laws and simultaneously oblivious of them. So laws of motion is about a world where objects are alive and bodies can be in more than one place simultaneously. And this for me was the world up until 2020. I mean, explicitly, it's 2008 to 2020. From the moment that we all realized that there was nothing below us and we had to look down, and then the financial markets came down with us. And then we entered the world of cartoon villains. We entered Trump as Elmer Fudd. But now it is a new world. You know, the structure of feeling, which is a phrase by Marxist literary theorist Raymond Williams, is a way of looking at culture and using parts of it in their connectivity to look at what will come next. It's like a low-level hum that, if we attune to it, will show us a lot about life. In 2020, I made a sequel to Laws of Motion, and it's a ghost train. It's a kind of ghost train of solitary cars in a sort of Disney world, as that's what came after the cartoon world the first time around. The golden age of cartoons was a kind of realism, and then Disneyland was another kind of realism. So now we're like on the outer edge of the cartoon landscape. There's just like a fragmented world where parts of Wordsworth's Prelude haunt it, and so does Freud's interpretation of dreams. It's the ancient past muddled simultaneously with a very recent past in a kind of dream logic. It's endlessly self-referential meme logic, and it has a return to bodies and a return to solitude. So we now find ourselves at the bottom of the cliff, no longer able to enter the space of suspended animation. There you go. That's my...
I think that deserves a clap. I'm not sure any of my questions are really going to help, to be honest. I mean, I had such diverse work, what's the principle? And you basically just said what the principle is. I mean, I think that there are so many interconnected thoughts. I want to kind of read that again because I don't think I've got it all in my head. But I think that that a whole idea of the world has become a cartoon, and we're dealing with Boris being the most kind of cartoon-like character ever. I mean, Trump, but you know, we've still got that kind of political creature that. So I mean, I'm interested in your political take on the world, but also then it's the kind of macro micro. It's looking at kind of massive political, and then going back to a sort of nest. And what does a nest mean to you as a kind of as a trope in a way, as something that contains and holds? I suppose I'm going to ask one thing, which is a relationship between analog and digital, which I think I'm interested with both of you. Is that, and Lydia, the idea that you scoot from making something that is a scan that we look at in a kind of scan-like way, and then you make a giant pyramid out of knitting, and you become a cartoon self, and this sort of, how does that work? How do you slip between? And also that in some way you seem to be like an archetypal sort of 1970s character here, and yet you're also precipitating into the future, dealing with how Newton works in, I don't know what to say.
Great question.
It was hopeless, sorry.
I don't know. That's like a therapy session rather than a question like, how do you cope? I mean, I don't know. What can I say? I mean, a lot of them are quite long bodies of work. So you spend time like setting these things, and then you kind of wait for the right moment for it to make the final part of it to make sense. So something like the work with my dad was like quite long journeys. So you're sort of mapping these things, building them up as you go, and then waiting for the right shape to find that you can put it in sometimes. And your observation about like the swinging between the macro and the micro is that's true. I think that's like a good observation. It's a bit like what I was saying about this kind of slipping back. All my work often starts with a very personal kind of anecdotal status. Maybe Laws of Motion is less so, but then ironically that's the one I appear in as a cartoon character, so I'm kind of embedded in it anyway. But for me to get somewhere kind of abstract is I often have to go in these like very personal doors. So with something's at stake or something's potentially embarrassing, something's you got to risk something or genuinely want to work something out. Otherwise it doesn't work. If you just ask a kind of abstract question, I get lost because it's too big. So I find these ways into which can seem very personal, and it seems like it might be about me or something, and then gradually the further you get in, the more I disappear out the frame. Like it seems like I'm right there, and you think, and then when you stay with it, you realise I kind of gradually exit, and by the end it's about something else. So it's a sort of, but it's quite hard to generalise about the work. So I that's why things like this are quite tricky in some ways, because I'm normally talking about something. Actually, the book you got there, which is like the new book that I just did,
I need to
right?
flag that up a bit. I've just got it. I haven't even opened it yet.
But this is like it might not work. It's kind of, this was difficult because it's like, so the one way of how do I talk about my work in general, when a lot of the project specific have these frameworks, which is like, so Laws of Motion is cartoons plus physics plus philosophy plus economics, and so it kind of has its shape to it. And natural selection was days spent in the vaults of natural history museums, really engaging with ornithologists, natural historians. Like it's very particular language that you have to build up for those projects. But then you learn to speak and you embody it. And at that time, it's like inside you, you are that. Like I had to be able to hold a conversation with the head of the natural history at the American Museum of Modern Art to be able to natural history, to spend time in the vaults. You learn their language and you take it seriously and you embody it. And then but then you kind of come out of that, you pop out of that, and then you're into this other kind of head state. And so then what is this like umbrella, like what's that thing above it? Like what's that layer that's kind of you that links it? And in the book, what I did was just went through the internet and took every blog interview that I'd ever done in like 10 years, which was a lot, and they're all weirdly particular. It's like I'm talking either interviewed on a craft blog, then I'm interviewed on a physics blog, then I'm interviewed on an art one, but then like a student one, you know, and you speak in a different language, actually, I noticed each time. So all I did was take all those things and just string them together and cut them together, because it was the only way. There's no like way of making an overarching statement other than these like fragments that you
What
put into
also
the world.
interests me about that is it goes from being free and on the web and you can go and get it all yourself, and you've made it into a product. And that, again, that interesting thing between analog and digital, that you've made something that was digital and available into something else.
But I'd say
which is interesting as well.
But why that is because that's all kind of vanishing. I think that world of blogs is also done. Like it's all been reduced to the like kind of pithy little thing. Like there was this really weird period of like 10 years where everyone had blogs and you could talk. There was no end. There's like no word count. So you could just go on and on. You could just stream this like verbal diarrhea onto people's websites, and they would like print, you know, because no one would even edit it. It would just be put up. But that's kind of changed. So that's like an archive of that. And that period where, for me, like, and I noticed some of those websites were disappearing. So actually, like, okay, now I'm going to grab them because actually, I think I only knew what I was doing in kind of the moment of doing it. Like anything I say about it afterwards is kind of with a critical distance or disingenuous. So like that proximity when you're in it and you're inhabiting the language of your work is like the kind of this valuable space, you know, which I can't maybe access anymore. So it's like the last portal to like what I know about what it was I was doing.
Yeah, well, I'm very much looking forward to reading it, and I suggest everybody get it. We're going to move on to Lydia now. Thank you. Talking about just now as well as the whole idea of working it out, and you know, kind of, are you working it out in the moment? And I have just completely loved working with Lydia because she worked that out. She made that exhibition happen. I just thought I'd kind of set up a little bit about how we found Lydia. We got in touch with a set designer called Gary Card, who, if you don't know his work, do look at it. He's amazing. And he said, you've got to go with Lydia. She's completely inventive. And we asked Lydia to present us with an idea, and she came with basically that. And this is what I find extraordinary with these minds, is that she had a very, very clear idea of how the exhibition space was going to look on a computer, and then it arrived, and it became a world, which we have had such an amazing response. I mean, it's really gratifying to see how many people are coming in and seeing it and being part of it. It was hard, but I mean, you know, I don't know how many pieces there were that we put together.
Like 1,000 something.
And that all had to be painted, so it was full on. So I think it's interesting here. We've seen a lot of finished work with you guys, and the kind of the end. But I think what's lovely about having Lydia here is actually knowing that, yeah, it's tough to make it happen for sure. I was thinking about Andy's rejecting the physics of Isaac Newton and the idea of kind of playing havoc with space. And I think that's what you did to the space, is you kind of turned it upside down. That Lydia, like your work, kind of turned our gallery space upside down. And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about your relationship to cartoons, because I know, like these guys, you also have a relationship with cartoons, and that they've kind of informed your work.
I think my relationship with cartoons is that's just what I grew up with. I think I used to watch, in Canada, there's a channel called YTV. I think it's supposed to be like youth television. It's channel 25, check it out. I think the average age for that was supposed to be like from 5 until like 15 or something, but up until like I moved to London when I was like 20 something or even 25, I was still watching YTV. I just love cartoons. I think it's, I don't know, like I think it's like just something that I'm naturally drawn to. Like if you see a rack of clothes and there's something that's like orange, I'm there. If you see like, you know, in the sea of black and gray and whatever, if there's something that's like a bright color, like the graphic lines, I'm there. You know, it's not even like a thought process or, you know, like why do I love it? There's no why. It's just like intuition. That's what I'm attracted to. It's like, you know, and I think
Does that have to do with the maximalist bit? Because we also loved Lydia for saying she was a maximalist. I mean, that was like, that's what we need. We need a maximalist right now.
I think it's kind of like, you know, when you're a kid, like you keep feeding children all these like bright, colorful toys and all these like things because it's like an immediate, visceral experience. You're like, wow, colors, you know? And I just never grew up from that. Like, there's nothing about like gray or like, you know, curated, sophisticated colors that like, you know, appeal to me in any meaningful way. It's like that, like, wow, colors, wow, like, you know, like that kind of immediacy and how loud it is and how like, you know, give me the goods, you know.
But there's still there's a very specific aesthetic around the color. I think. I mean, the color is very specific. It's not like it's any old color. It's
definitely.
It's very beautiful. You know, they're beautiful hues. I mean, I feel like you've always been a maker. You said how your dad brought some beads back from Hong Kong, and you've kind of been making bead stuff, for example. It's so, again, I wanted maybe to come back to these guys as to actually you've made for a long time. So it's, you make that you also kind of make in another way too.
Yeah, I think a big part of all the things that I do or all my work is kind of informed by the making process. So like I said in the video, like when I have some kind of like fantasy of what I want to make or what the thing is going to be, the process of making it changes and there's experimentation and like, you know, you go through the process of like, is it going to work? I don't know. And then at the end something comes out and I'm always surprised. So I think the making process has a lot to do with the final result. Like, you know, if I tell you what it's going to be, the end is not going to be what I told you it's going to be.
Whereas you guys, do you feel if you say it's going to be like that, you know it's going to be like that?
I don't know, I find sometimes you can get to the end of a project and then look back on a sketchbook and be like, oh yeah, okay. It kind of was the idea I had initially, but I've started to find though, like, especially making films, it's just like forcing an idea into clarity, where at all times you have it in your mind's eye, but you're just at each stage kind of forcing it closer to this point of clarity, and it doesn't always feel good. At times it feels like, oh god, I didn't think about that bit, right?
Yeah, I'm sure it's right. I also wanted, because I don't know if anybody knows that the whole idea behind the exhibition was really a reaction to COVID, and the idea that you would walk into the space and your eyes would be given a kind of different perspective.
Yeah, the exhibition is called Your Ship Has Landed because it was supposed to be like reinterpreting our lockdown experience as like Interstellar, where like we're stuck in a spaceship for like an infinite amount of time, we're getting really old and gross, and then, you know, we're like stuck inside this like beige box, which is like basically all our flats are like white walls and magnolia. And then you like leave your magnolia box and suddenly everything is like much more colorful and intense because you haven't been outside in ages, and so like it was kind of like reinterpreting nature as like this super surreal, hyper active space, like a new alien planet. And like, you know, that's kind of what lockdown was supposed to be, right? We were supposed to be like stuck in this space, and hopefully like by the time we leave, COVID will be over and then we'll be safe again, yay. So that was supposed to be the alien planet was like, we're stuck in, like, you know, in Interstellar when you're like trying to find a new planet to inhabit because our old planet is like garbage now. So that was kind of like the idea, but obviously, you know, Omicron, so we're still stuck in COVID times.
Yeah, but at least you made a space that people can come and kind of enjoy and you know, really. I think it's probably about time for us to open the questions to the floor. I think I said that wrong. Has anybody got any questions that they would like to ask our fantastic panelists? Yeah, please.
I have a question for Rachel. I mean, I have questions for all of you because your all of your work is fascinating. But having seen your exhibition at Josh Lilly, and as you were saying, it was his first time doing an animation. In terms of the practical work and the effort, was it? Did you actually make it, or was it you got other people to do it?
It was a mixture. So I made, in my studio with the studio assistant, we made like the doll and the 3D model and effectively the character design. And I also strangely like made an entire film where I played the character myself and edited it and did all the sounds, so effectively had like a full kind of reference for the film. And then went to an animation company and worked with them to animate it. But it was pretty hands-on, and I still kind of made all the backgrounds and things afterwards. But yeah, it was a totally different process, maybe from what I was saying earlier. Just from the animation, you really just have to kind of break everything down in a way that you don't when you do things live action. So
I was kind of wondering then from that, after making it, were you like, that was cool, I've learned a lot, I never ever want to do that again, I'm going back to film? Or were you thinking more like, oh, that was amazing and I've been able to do all these different things I couldn't do with film, and actually I think I'm going to do more animation then?
it's hard to know when you like. If you'd asked me just after I finished it, I'd be like, I'm never doing that again. That was like exhausting. But I think the things that you can do with animation that I was excited by were, I wanted to do a lot with gravity in the sense of like almost that 3D space that you can explore gravity and you're not having to worry about the reality of gravity, if that makes sense. So I was able to do things in a much cheaper and more free way than you could if you were doing it with visual effects and shooting live action. So that was good. But yeah, it was painstaking in a way that I've not experienced before, and all my work is quite painstaking. So I think you just have to wait for like until you forget about how difficult it was, and then you can come back round to making something like that again.
Like giving birth, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about the dystopian part of the work, because the original sort of inspired this, but I wanted to know for you the dystopia came from planets introducing sort of a externalized version of life from the world itself.
I think it's really interesting, the idea of dystopias. I think that you all look at, and I think that what you've created with this exhibition, Lydia, is unlike anything we could have imagined. Lydia or Andy, do you have any thoughts about how dystopia kind of features
Well, I
in
don't
your
think
work?
mine has anything to do with dystopia, so I'll pass over to Lydia.
Yeah, I don't know if this has anything to do with that either. Sorry.
Don't worry, we're back to...
Yours definitely does. You do it.
I think I'm interested in utopia, I suppose. I guess maybe what I was saying about children's television. I've just had like an intense weekend because my 2-year-old's been ill, and I've just been watching like so much Peppa Pig.
That's a dystopia.
Oh man, I watched the whole, and then you got full circle, so I've seen the whole of Peppa Pig more than once
Oh my
in the last few days. But I think I was interested in that because it is this kind of utopia, almost a kind of Green and Pleasant Land sort of British, English kind of fantasy cartoon utopia, and I'm always interested in interrogating those kind of spaces because they're complex and they talk a lot about a kind of collective fantasy. So I don't know if that's a good answer to your question, but yeah.
Yes.
I have a question for Lydia. So it was, first of all, it's really amazing. And then I remember I just walked in and I saw a sign that says, "Oh, please take off your shoes when you walk on the platform." I was like, "You're telling me I can take off my shoes and go out there?" I was like, "Hell yeah, that's so exciting!" And so I took my shoes, hopped on the platform, and it was like jumping around, and it sparked such like primitive joy in my heart. It's like almost dancing around fire when we were little. I thought it's like amazing to have something that's so like infectious, and it's really nice to have that. So I'm just wondering, when you create your work, are you, what's your feel? What's your creative feel? What's your, what motivates you the most? Like your thoughts or just emotion and abstract? I found that really fascinating.
I think when I make things, it's from like quite a selfish perspective. I just make something that makes me happy, and then I put it out into the world. And I'm like, if it makes me happy, I can't be the only person in the world that this is gonna make happy. So I'm sure other people will also be happy from it, and then I hope it makes other people happy. So sometimes I come back here and I'll like sit in the corner, and then there's like other kids who are having fun or people who are like enjoying it, and then I kind of enjoy that like what made me happy also made all these other people happy. So it's like my way of connecting with these people without actually speaking to them.
That's brilliant. And also, it's like such a whimsical approach you always take, things. it's almost so fluid, almost so abstract, but the emotion, energy comes out quite accurately. Has there any been situation where you're seeing just went completely off record? That's not something you imagined, or you kind of work with new media and it just was completely like a train wreck.
Was it a train wreck?
No, like ever in your design process, not for this project, but as like an artist, have you ever tried to experiment with new things and it didn't work out, or
No, I don't know. I think as a person, I'm very like, I'm gonna make this fucking work. It's gonna be a thing. I don't care. No, I refuse. Yeah. So if it doesn't work, it's gonna be. It's
gonna make it work.
Yeah, it's gonna be a thing. It's fine.
I think we can vouch for that.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much.
That's for sure. Does anybody else have any questions? Yes.
I got a question for Annie. Yeah, I remember the part you said you put a rock back to the print.
Mm-hmm.
I understand why you did that, because you try to fulfill your conscience. But do you think from the other angle? Because I came from China, and I took my dad to the British Museum once. I told my dad and my dad said, oh, they were from China. I said, it's good that actually they took it, because they preserved it better. I went to Egypt before. I was there 14 years ago, and I found that the people there, they don't preserve better. So why don't we keep that and show the next generation, because you can preserve better?
I mean, it's kind of the subtext of the whole work in some ways. It's like, the one hand there's the personal guilt, on the other hand there is the colonial guilt, and that was like a question that whether the returning of cultural artifacts was kind of teased at, rather than making some comment either way. I just sort of play out the narrative, and what was interesting was that the first thing that happened was that it was like an article about it in a newspaper, and they, in the Telegraph I think it was, and they like got a quote from someone from the British Museum saying that you shouldn't have taken that, sort of saying that the piece that the artwork was questionable because I'd taken something from the UNESCO site. Which was kind of funny because it was coming from the British Museum, who like their entire back, let's have a look at their cupboards. I mean, but that was but actually the piece was that this narrative was playing out on quite a cultural level at the time. And so actually my work got tagged onto a lot of, the way it got most traction was oddly that Egypt were having a new museum in Cairo, and they were asking for a lot of objects back, which I didn't know when I thought of the piece. But so my piece got tagged into a lot of news stories about Egypt sort of asking for the return of certain objects because they changed the condition. They were opening a big new museum where they were suddenly wanting to care for objects. Of course, my object was not one of the objects they wanted back. I mean, that was of no interest. I mean, that was like, they're not talking about that. They were talking about the rest of the British Museum. So it was like teasing these things, the personal connecting to the bigger political without. And sometimes it's more powerful not to say either which way, because there is an argument, this dispersion of cultural artifacts enriches all of us in some ways, but the way they were acquired, perhaps did not, was aimed to enrich certain, whilst impoverishing others. The dynamic of which this happened was dubious in many ways. So, it teases at those things and makes you like. And what was quite interesting when I did it was I got a lot of letters because it became this news story from people saying, oh, I got this piece of pottery that I stole from Greece, I got this thing that I stole from there. Because of course it's kind of human nature to want and to try and to take and to understand and want a souvenir, this question of a souvenir. And this this movement of cultural artifacts and kind of almost parodying that narrative in a sort of way, but in a way that was also genuine. It probably wouldn't work if I was just making a comment on it, but I actually did feel bad from having done it, and there was but there was this moment when I went back to Egypt, and it took me ages to work out how to do it because I couldn't climb on the pyramids anymore, and so I had to pay off police to allow me to climb on the pyramid.
I did that as well.
And so I had to
I paid them like 2 Egyptian pounds each.
Yeah. Interesting, right? Yeah. So mine was Arts Council money, so it was quite it was quite interesting. And the longer I wanted to stay on, the more of my Arts Council budgets disappeared. But what was I going to say? But then the people I had to rope in to help me do it they never thought to ask what it was like I was putting back, and suddenly I got the thing. They were like, "Oh, where is it?" They expected me to bring it out of a bag or like bring some cart, and I was like, "Oh, it's this one." And then everyone was like, "This is what this whole thing is about. This tiny thing." And of course, that's the point. It's kind of both inconsequential and consequential simultaneously. Both things at the same time.
Thanks.
It's interesting though, what's the work of art there? Is it you standing on the pyramid with the Egyptian police? You know, I think that's for another discussion, but it's it probably is time. I just found this quote, which I don't know where this comes from, Andy, but it's something to do with you, which said, it's about I don't know what it's about the intense sadness of our unrealistic dreams and the intense joy of our desire for them, which I just think is brilliant. I think about
That's
all
from-
our work. Where's that from?
That was written when I was 17 on a cafe table in Bedford. Yeah,
Oh.
that was that's in the MIMS manifesto. Yeah,
Great.
yeah.
I think that's where we're at. There's one more question over here. Yep, go for it.
I have a question. I'm hoping I phrased this okay. It's still brilliant, actually. The question is, how do you find the position as artist, as authority of your work? Do you find it difficult, challenging, / exciting, / Because I think with your works, there's so much, and I think you brought this up with the sort of a layering effect, particularly in your work. I teach Ravensbourne and teach design, and so much of that is about locating your audience, communicating very clearly, and I'm just very interested with artists, like how you find that position as artists, as authority of their work in the work that you make.
I think that's also, I think you talk about the authentic voice as well.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I would say like something I'm super interested in how much you control the narrative of your own practice, you know, and how much you do. And I always made it my thing to put everything into the work, to put the interpretation and the framework, but consider that part of the work itself rather than sit it outside, because then it kind of gets it out of the way. Like I was always of this idea that it could only make things more complicated. Like because you can get rid of all the simple stuff straight away by just kind of like, but yeah, the interpretation around it, that your interpretation around it is also inclusive, like should be brought within the work itself. So for me, that's something I'm always wrestling with. Yeah, like to make the interpretation of the piece part of the work itself.
I thought what was interesting about the book that you've made, it's almost like the way I read it is you're sort of searching for some sort of clarity in stuff that you've said previously. So you're almost going through it, going, if I just pile all this together and put some logic to it, I've got an answer to something.
Yeah, and it should feel like that it's authoritative, but of course there's so many contradictory things because you're saying one thing here and another. Of course, when you put it together, that authority sort of collapses because it's kind of, you know, your position becomes very hard to make some kind of. And a lot of it is always about searching for the authentic voice. Absolutely, always like trying to. But let somebody else answer.
I think for me, I think that good art is always a balance between like clarity and mystery. And if it's too clear and on the nose, you're like, it's just flat. And if it's too mysterious, you kind of can't even be bothered. So I don't know, I always find like you're trying to get the balance and sometimes it falls too far in one direction or the other, but I don't know if that quite plays into authority, but I think that to a certain extent you need to know what you're doing, but then there also needs to be a degree to which you allow yourself to do something without entirely knowing why you're doing it, and it's this kind of push and pull between rationality and something a little bit more
And then galleries ask you to come and talk about it, and then you
yeah, I'll show you.
can go into Neuros and write some stuff down.
Oh, I feel like I have no authority over what my work is supposed to do or say or whatever. I mean, I can say whatever I want, and then you interpret it however you want, but your interpretation is equally valid as what I'm trying to say. So, you know, there's nothing. Whatever you want, man. That's
Thanks.
the authority.
Practical question, I'm curious. So, your art is so marvelous and full of practical material that you have to use. My curiosity is, when you start and project such big installations and great art, do you first, how does it work? Do you first invest the money to buy the material to create the installation, or is always some client, some museum that sponsor you to create an artwork that you design and show them the project first? What comes first? How does it work? Just curious.
Who wants to answer that? Isn't it always different?
Different, yeah.
It's always like you start going sometimes and you go a little way, and then if you're lucky, somebody intervenes and takes it over, you know. So it's like, yeah, and there's no guarantee that one rhythm will kind of emerge. You know, after doing something like the Beano show was a commission, and you know what the budget is, and then you decide to do it. But then straight after that, I have to go back to the DIY and back to the table, and I start again, and I develop an idea, and I'm sitting on it, and then I hope that I'll find the right place, or someone will come along, and I'll develop it until until it finds the right space. So sometimes, and often it's, for me, and I don't know if it's true, I always keeping a few going at once. So there's some that are low level that I just totally invest in time or research, and they sit there quietly, just simmering, you know, and then they might sit there for ages until someone asks you the right space or the right moment arrives, and sometimes you're not thinking about it, and it comes out of the blue with an opportunity, and then you react, so you go in. But often I will, when presented with an opportunity, I will look what's on the board, like look what was kind of there, and be like, oh yeah, I'll take that one, I can do that one. So yeah, it's a bit of both all the time for me.
Yeah, I think I'm the same, where I guess I work quite a lot to briefs, in the sense that you're given a certain budget and often given like a context, and it can be like a physical context, but often I work.
So just to be kind of concrete, with Jupiter, for instance, with Jupiter, did they say you've got X amount to make that?
Sort of, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so it's obviously not that straightforward.
I got like kind of free reign it's quite an extensive sculpture park, and I got to pick like which locations, so there's a kind of degree of freedom, but I think maybe because, well, like you were saying, Lydia, I'm a maximalist, it helps to have some kind of limitation put on you, so I actually find it quite useful, some kind of brief or something that forces you to hone your idea down, because otherwise you do just have lots of things on your plate and you could make any of them. So it tends to be the person who comes along and gives you the project that forces you to pick one or the other.
Anybody else? Oh, last question.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I got a question for all three of you. I see Lydia was doing a painting while doing the project. Do you find like really boring when you do the project? I understand your idea is great, and obviously it's always interesting, but when you actually do it, do you find it really boring because it's one day and you got the whole paint and smelling so bad? I know the paint smells good.
What's the question here?
Is
it really boring?
No, once you've had the idea, then you just have to go through with it. Does it like become less? Did you have fun making that?
It's really boring.
No, the making process is what drives the idea. So without making, there's no idea. Like the idea is only like the seed, you know, like you need to grow the thing, and in the process of making it changes. And you know, everyone loves being dirty and disgusting and covered in paint and sawdust and just being gross all the time. It's me. So not boring. It's the primo quality life.
I think it's good that we ended with Lydia. Oh, one last.
Wait.
Yep.
I'm interested in like revisiting your ideas and also like parking them. Like when you talk about this about your art, I think you're all very different and it could be interesting to just like if there is something that actually makes you like park something or that makes you possibly revisit them for like a certain situation, or it's just intuition for each of you.
Parking ideas. Are you clear about that? I'm not.
You've got something on the back burner and it's just.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think this exhibition was definitely like a parked idea from many years ago.
So you don't think you're gonna revisit something that you created here?
I think like maybe, but you know, when I finished making this, I kind of thought like this is Lydia from like 2015. this is what Lydia wanted to make in 2015. I'm like, is this the thing that Lydia wants to make now? I'm not really sure, but I was like, this has like been inside of me trying to come out for like years and years and years, and then it came out, and I'm like, do I really relate with this now? But you know, so this is a parked idea, very parked.
So last question to all three of you: if you could do anything in the next year, anything, what would you do? I mean, you can, you know, it could be anything.
Artistically?
Yeah.
Oh.
Just like, I just feel like, you know, a quick thing just to finish the evening with. Lydia, what would you design or make in the next year?
I want to do like more sculpture, do a whole collection of chairs, maybe do more, I mean, because I'm a set designer, so do more like hotel lobbies, do shop windows, that kind of thing. But mainly, I think, you know, this is like Lydia day mode, colors, day mode. I think we're going to usher in a new era, Lydia night mode, where she just works in black. That's what's going to happen next. Night mode.
Huge.
Maybe it doesn't work all weekend as well and into the evening. So
Yeah.
a whole new thing. You don't have to answer it, Andy. Any thoughts about what's happening next?
Well, I am deep into a new film, so it's impossible to like not. I have no choice but it to be that, and it is one I've been wanting to make for ages. So
that's exciting.
I'm in a whole new world.
Do we know where that might be so we can go and see it?
Yeah, so the Whitworth in Manchester in May.
Oh, the Whitworth is brilliant. So that's good. We will go to Manchester.
So it's like but it's just that fun time where it's pretty much all you can think about. Where I wake up at 4 a.m. and I'm stressed about it, and I think about it, and everything connects to it. So it's kind of one of those, which is fun because you're kind of on these 4-year cycles, like often these long cycles, you know, and then you're there waiting till you got the idea, waiting, and then suddenly there's a moment where you're just under, and you have to stay under for a while, and that's it. So I'm just under with that until it happens, and then I'll have a thought process that isn't about it.
We're definitely going to Manchester in May. That sounds good. I'd love to
go. See you there.
Any thoughts? I mean, either pretend or not pretend?
I probably not pretend. I'm working on a deep fake project, so I'm quite into like, I guess because it feels to me like a sort of AI equivalent of what I do anyway. And I'm also working on a feature film, so, but I think that's like not 1 year, that's like 5 years if I'm lucky. I'll make it.
Oh, that'd be fantastic. We're looking forward to that. Yeah. Thank you guys for coming. We really appreciate it. Do make sure you see Lydia's show before you go. The bar will be open for another kind of 10 minutes. And massive thank you to Lydia who made this happen, and it's just made us all really happy. Huge thank you to Andy for coming all the way from Bedford and dealing with, you know, massive stuff, for coming and being here this evening. Thank you.
It's fun.
And Rachel came all the way from Glasgow, so I think it's always good for us to have